Do you remember the movie 300?
Yes, it's a great movie. Zack Snyder,
Yeah,
banger.
this is Sparta, right? Where
Yeah.
the messenger comes from Xerxes and presenting Sparta with an offer it can't refuse. Well, Sparta actually refused it. So let me give a little bit of background of that. We're going to talk a little bit about strategy. In the Greek world, the person who tells this story is Herodotus. And in the Greek world, you know the greatest sin in the Greek world?
No, what is it?
Hubris. You know what hubris
Oh,
is?
yeah.
Arrogance.
Essentially,
Arrogance,
yeah, it's
right?
pride.
So
Yeah.
it's basically believing yourself a god. This is the depiction of Xerxes
In the movie.
in
Yeah.
that movie.
Yeah.
He seems to, I think he even says it in the movie, I am a living God.
Yes.
That's
Yep.
something that the Greeks would have portrayed him as saying, for sure. This is the moral side of the story, right? The Greeks have this whole view of the world that the worst thing you can do is imagine yourself as a god. You have to always see yourself below the gods, right? It's hubris to
Hmm.
think yourself a god.
Yeah.
So this whole story is laced with that. And there's even this scene early where Xerxes is building the first bridge across what's called the Hellespont, right? It's a strait to get over from Persia, modern day Iran,
Hmm.
hint hint, right? To Greece. And it fails, and there's this scene there. Xerxes basically commands his people to whip the sea, right? So this is an example of, yeah, hubris,
Yeah.
right? That you actually believe that you're like a god, like Poseidon. You can whip the sea and it will obey your command. Do you know the background of this war? When Herodotus is telling this, Darius, his father, they had been at war before because you have to think of it from Persia's point of view. From Persia's point of view, Greece was a bunch of just little raggedy city-states on the other side of the strait, right? On the very edge of their empire. Some of the things you don't know when you're being told this story is what actually caused this. Why would, because when it's told in Hollywood and afterwards, Greece saved Western civilization. But for Persia, it was like the city states actually aligned a lot of the times with Persia. So that kind of
Hmm.
undermines this whole story.
Yeah.
And I'll get back to that.
Well, that's
But
what Sparta was, right? Was Sparta a city state?
they were all city states at the time. You had like
Troy. Yeah.
Thebes, the Ionian city states, Athens, Troy was on the other side, right? But these city states, because they were so spread out, they weren't really united. They'd have to have coalitions if they wanted to fight against Xerxes. One of them rebelled against his father, and Athens at the time provided support. And then his father lost at a battle called Marathon. Xerxes, and you see in this picture, Athens will burn. His whole goal was to avenge his father for that rebellion and that loss at Marathon, right? Athens, because they had helped the rebels, he wanted to punish Athens. Getting nerdy here on the history, but we're going to get into the asymmetric costs. So Herodotus tells you there are like millions of troops that he has to get across that bridge. He actually built a second bridge, so he didn't fail. Maybe the sea listened to him this time after he whipped it, right? But he built another bridge across. He was building a complex supply chain so that when he's sent across, they think maybe 200 to 500,000 troops, which is a lot in ancient times, to punish the city states, the Greek city states. They get across, and there's the scene at Thermopylae, right? So Thermopylae is the Battle of the 300. It was more than 300 Spartans, right? But
Yeah.
that's where the
Yeah.
movie's talking about that. So Xerxes is coming across, bringing a massive land army with him, right? And he's bringing a massive navy to support. The whole point of the story, and this is the famous story of Thermopylae, where the 300 stand against this 200, 500,000. Remember, we talked about the lion and the fox. In this case, the fox is just standing, right? It's trying to force that big army, which is like the lion, into a narrow pass and let the rest of the Greek city states prepare for what's coming, at least slow them down. Because they're on their way into the mainland, right, to punish Athens. You get the feeling in the movie that they succeeded, right? And that's how it's told. They saved Greece and the Western civilization at that pass. Do you know what happened after?
It was a big war. I mean, that was
What
the.
happened after? What happened after is actually they broke through because they were betrayed, is the way the story was told,
Yeah.
and they actually went down to Athens and burned it.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
That's not in the movie
No. And
because
then.
it kind of undermines the whole thing of we beat Persia.
Yeah.
It turns out probably we don't have any many sources from Persia. From their perspective, maybe they won,
Yeah.
right? Now let's get into the asymmetric cost. So there were two battles afterwards that Greece did win, and that forced Persia back. But it had mainly accomplished its goals of punishing Athens and avenged
Yeah.
his father's disaster at Marathon. Okay, that's kind of suspicious. Well, why does it feel like in that movie that they saved them at Thermopylae when they actually made it down into Athens? Well, they abandoned Athens, and the most famous battle there is at Salamis, I believe it's called, where Themistocles, the head of the navy, how would you beat? We talked about this already with Napoleon. How do you beat a big military? Is you use that size against them, right? And they had a big navy, and what Themistocles was able to do was to impossibly through deception. He was sending letters in some of the other city states.
Hmm.
Some of the other city states had actually joined the Persians against the Spartans and the Athenians. That's also not told in the story. Why would the defenders of Western civilization choose the other side, right? He was sending somehow deceptive notes, perhaps claiming that they were going to flee the Greeks. So then they brought in the navy, but they brought it into this narrow strait. And inside the narrow strait, the Greeks had the advantage as the foxes. They had the naval skills. The Athenians were known for that. So they used that size again of the navy against it, trapped them into that narrow pass. They destroyed that navy essentially. It's a big loss for Xerxes. Xerxes was then afraid that the Greeks would sail over and destroy that bridge that he had built to cross. And if they did that, then his land army would be trapped without supplies, right? There were two critical points there. One was using the size of the navy against them, and they were fleeing Athens, so that was part of their strategy too. They fled, they let them burn it. They didn't want to face them because they knew they would lose against those numbers in the land too. But then once the naval battle was lost, Xerxes had to pull his troops out. And then he left one general there called Mardonius, I think is his name. And then he got beat at another battle. In the end, they were able to have two key victories, but it's still not clear if, from Persia's perspective, that they actually lost. They still essentially accomplished the goal of burning the city and
Right.
punishing
Yeah.
the rebellion, right? But I think it's an interesting one, given what's happening in that part of the world, to think about what is the probability that the Greek version that we got is true,
Pretty
right?
low.
Yeah, the victors tell the story. You're not ever sure what actually happened there. And they have the tendency in the past to exaggerate. I mean, Herodotus is considered the father of history, but still, you don't have the other side's view. And it's possible. It's possible that they both saw themselves as winning that.
For
The
sure.
Greeks, like, yeah, whew, they left. They didn't destroy all of our city states, right? They
Well,
burned down Athens, but,
yeah.
and then the Persians, like, yeah, basically, we punished them. They learned their lesson. Some of those city states are basically aligned with us. They're not going to give us any more trouble. Let's go back home to where there are actually bigger enemies on the horizon.
Both sides of conflicts aren't always going to have the same agreement as to what constitutes a victory.
That's right.
So, what may be a victory for the larger empire may not be a victory for the smaller city state who, may just have one or two guys still throwing spears and that's enough. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, and that's always a strategic question. And I came across that reading Hebrew history. At one point, the Hebrews turned to kings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is always a question. Before they had been like little tribes, right, spread out into little cities. And when they had a war, they would collect everybody, like not conscription necessarily, but volunteer army to defend.
Yeah.
Once they went to the king, then you centralize that conscription and taxes, and you have a standing army. And the question strategically is, which one is better? It's not clear. Like, so Xerxes, when he attacked Greece, he would have to attack a bunch of different city states to take over the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that maybe is harder than just defeating one centralized capital. So your target is clear. So this is always the debate, right? Do you want to have distributed power so it's harder to overtake you? Or do you want to centralize it? The Hebrews centralized it, and then they lost to Assyria, and then they lost to Babylon, right? And then eventually the Persians also took over and sent them, well, returned them from exile.
Yeah.
So the question is like, what is the best model of national defense? Is it to distribute that power into local centers, or is it to have it all in one place? Because having it all in one place,
It's risky.
it's risky, right? It exposes you to if they beat that one city where all the power is in one big battle, then you're done,
Yeah.
right? And I think you see that all across history, even in the Gettysburg battle, right? For most of that war, Lee was trying to avoid those types of battles
Yeah.
with good reason,
For
right?
sure.
So yeah, that's a very good question, and it has to do with business because when you're a startup, you're more like these city states, right?
Sure.
You're trying to find a model that works for your little niche, and then the question for you is always going to be, do you want to become the big Persian Empire, right? Which comes at the cost of you might have to go fight these little nuisances on your borders. And normally they're not a threat, but there's always the threat. We went over that with Alexander, the rise of Macedon, that little city turns into a new business model that then scales and takes over the whole territory. So I think there's always this give and take between bigness, which then has a tendency to get super bureaucratic, harder to administer the bigger it gets and the more territory it has, and then remaining small, where you're more efficient, but you do have a problem if a bigger army comes against you, right? So then the trick is to stay away, right? So lion, fox again.
It's interesting how history repeats itself, and the same tactics are valuable now that were valuable then in the regards of asymmetric cost. For instance, if we look at the pager attacks by Israel, Israel was tweeting out essentially how much they paid for the pager attacks on Lebanon because they were very cost effective. So it is an act of them letting the world know that they can do these kinds of attacks for very cheap. We see it right now in the Iranian conflict because interceptors cost millions and drones may cost five
Yeah,
figures.
and it depends if both sides have different goals. Let's just roll it all the way back. Greece's goal was just to survive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily to win. So if that was the standard, well, they won. And then Persia's goal is just to punish them, maybe not to take over them. And
Yeah.
if that was the standard, then they won.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure.
And I think in this current conflict, that's the question. What are the actual goals? What constitutes victory?
I
Is
don't
there a
know.
situation? This is always, with proud leaders like Xerxes, I'm not going to make any references to who's who, but is there a situation where they both come out believing they won? I don't know.
Yeah, probably.
That's usually what you're trying to get to in like negotiations, right?
Yeah, I think that's the only way it ends. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But let's see. I mean, you still see it playing out that the lion can punish you. But if you can just avoid like a fox long enough, maybe the lion runs out of energy, and or its supply chain gets cut or a strait, right, gets occupied,
Yeah.
right? And that causes a strategic problem with supply of energy, for example. Wouldn't have been much different for Xerxes if that bridge had been cut off.
Exactly.
They
Yeah.
would have been in deep trouble. So studying these old ones, and we're going to do this, I think, quite a lot on the show. Just stick with us. We're going to give these classical military examples because they are relevant for business.
Yeah.
It's the same game, right? How can you use the strengths of enemies against them? How can you position yourself maybe where you both win, where you don't even face each other head on? And then we'll go through some of these classical examples of what strategy is all about, and history repeats itself. And I don't know if it's useful to look at all this history because we keep repeating the same things over and over, but maybe that's because people don't read the history.
I think it is. And I think it is. And I think there's been a trend lately of erasing history because we don't like it. And I think that's a big mistake because we need to remember even the stuff we don't like because we learn valuable lessons from it and we change going forward.
But
Hopefully.
I think for some reason, we'd have to look at the data. People are starting to revert to Roman history for some reason.
Oh,
Like,
yeah. I think of the
you go
Roman
into-
Empire every day. That's a meme.
Yeah, that's a meme, right? But I think there's something real here. If you go into a Barnes and Noble, how many books on Stoicism are there?
A lot. It's
There are a
popular.
lot, right?
Yeah.
Like, why is that popular? And also, there's been this trend of a return to Catholicism. I don't know if you've seen that.
I have.
And it's not just the regular Catholic Mass. They want to do the old school Latin Mass, right? Well, why is that happening? And I think within Judaism, there's something similar happening. But it seems like something's going on in this modern world where people are being drawn to the past for some reason. And I'm a fan of looking at the past. I'm just wondering what that means. right?
So,
Why
yeah.
are we going back? Are we trying to look for these timeless principles, something to hold on to during massive uncertainty? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the something to hold on to, because when you have times of uncertainty, which we seem to have a lot of now, there's so much stimulus out there coming into our brains at all times from every angle. It makes it very loud, confusing, muddled. So if there's a singular voice that has the answer, and it's
A framework.
a framework or a set of instructions, or
Yeah.
the liturgy at a mass is a set in stone, this will lead you to salvation, that's going to be a calming voice in the noise. It's going to be something that you will tend to latch onto, and it may not even have to be the correct voice, but if it's a voice that believes what it's saying strong enough, it's going to convince enough people to. That's what happens when there's confusion.
Yeah, again,
People with the answers.
People are rushing from the uncertainty to try to find some certainty somewhere.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Indeed. Well, we'll unpack a lot more of this stuff as we go forward. I always learn a lot of stuff when Michael tells us a little bit about history, so I love that.
Hey, you've just watched a clip from Show Your Priors podcast. We hope you liked it. Check out our main channel for full episodes. We're also anywhere podcasts are found. Give us a like, subscribe. Doesn't cost you anything, but helps us out a ton. We'll see you back next week.